I'll never forget the moment I watched Vincent Caruso's champagne flute slip from his fingers at the Azure Room that night. The crystal shattered against marble like a gunshot, and every head in Manhattan's most exclusive restaurant turned toward the sound. But it wasn't the broken glass that made my blood run cold. It was the expression on his face. Vincent Caruso, the man who'd built an empire through ruthlessness and calculated silence, looked like he'd just seen a ghost. At 54, with that black rose tattoo bleeding down his neck like an open wound, he was a man accustomed to controlling every moment, every outcome. Yet there he sat, paralyzed, as a young waitress in a cheap polyester uniform stood before him with tears streaming down her face. She'd just spoken 5 words that would detonate his entire world. My mother has the same tattoo. I was there that night, watching from the shadows as I always do. I've seen empires rise and fall, watched powerful men crumble under the weight of their own secrets. But I'd never seen anything like what happened next. Because Vincent Caruso wasn't just any mob boss. He was a man who'd spent a quarter-century running from his past, drowning it in blood and money and power. And that girl, that beautiful, desperate girl with her mother's eyes, she was about to drag him back into the light, whether he wanted it or not. What I didn't know then was that this moment would unravel something far more dangerous than any territorial war, any betrayal, any vendetta. It would unravel the truth. And the truth, as they say, has a way of destroying everything it touches. New York City, the city that never sleeps, where fortunes are made and destroyed before breakfast, where the line between legitimate business and organized crime blurs like watercolor in rain. This is where our story begins, in the glittering underbelly of Manhattan, where men in $5,000 suits make decisions that ripple through families, through neighborhoods, through lives. Vincent Caruso owned this city the way other men own watches, carefully, completely. At 54 years old, he'd inherited his father's empire and transformed it into something far more sophisticated, far more dangerous. The tattoo on his neck, that black rose with thorns that seemed to writhe in certain light, was a relic from another life, another Vincent. A younger Vincent who'd believed in things like love and forever, a Vincent who'd made promises he couldn't keep. The Azure Room was his domain. Not officially, of course. Officially, it was just an exclusive restaurant where the city's elite gathered to celebrate mergers and acquisitions, to seal deals worth hundreds of millions. But everyone knew the truth. The Azure Room belonged to Vincent Caruso, and Vincent Caruso belonged to the 5 families that ran New York like a well-oiled machine, the kind of machine that occasionally needed blood to keep it running smoothly. That particular evening, Vincent was celebrating a victory. A rival operation had been neutralized, not violently, not yet anyway, but through the kind of financial maneuvering that left bodies in its wake just the same. His associate, Marco Santoro, sat across from him, nursing a glass of Macallan that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Marco was younger, hungrier, the kind of man who still believed that power and money could buy happiness. Vincent knew better. He'd learned that lesson a long time ago. Sophie Moretti had been working the Azure Room for 3 months. 3 months of invisible service, of watching the city's most powerful men conduct business over plates of caviar and glasses of wine that cost more than her monthly salary. She'd learned to move like a ghost, to anticipate needs before they were voiced, to exist in these spaces without truly being seen. It was a skill that had kept her alive, kept her and her mother alive, for the past 5 years. She didn't know who Vincent Caruso was when she first started. Not really. She'd heard the whispers, the careful way other servers spoke his name, the way the restaurant's owner personally ensured his table was perfect. But Sophie had learned long ago not to ask questions about the men who came here. Their money was good, their secrets were dangerous, and she had enough problems of her own. Before we continue, drop a comment telling me which city you're watching from. I love connecting with viewers from around the world. The evening had started like any other. Sophie arrived at the Azure Room at 5 o'clock, her uniform pressed, her shoes polished, her heart already heavy with the weight of another double shift. Her mother had been coughing again that morning, that deep, rattling cough that seemed to originate from somewhere dark and broken inside her chest. Elena Moretti was dying, though neither of them said it out loud. They didn't need to. Sophie could see it in the way her mother's hands trembled, in the way she slept 16 hours a day, in the way she'd stopped pretending that everything would be okay. The medical bills had stopped coming 3 months ago, not because they'd been paid, but because there was no point. Elena had no insurance, no resources, no options. The free clinic had turned them away twice. Sophie had taken every extra shift available, worked every double, sacrificed every moment of her own life to keep her mother alive. And it still wasn't enough. It would never be enough. Carol, the shift supervisor, pulled Sophie aside as she was tying her apron. VIP section tonight. The Caruso party. You're on their table. Sophie's stomach had dropped. The Caruso party meant serious money, serious men, serious consequences if anything went wrong. She'd served them once before, and the tension at that table had been so thick she could barely breathe. But she'd nodded, forced a smile, and made her way to the private section of the restaurant. Vincent Caruso was already there, seated at the corner table with its perfect view of Manhattan's glittering skyline. He was exactly as she remembered, tall, commanding, with the kind of presence that made the air around him seem to vibrate at a different frequency. His suit was charcoal gray, perfectly tailored, probably Italian. His watch was platinum, probably worth more than Sophie's entire apartment building. But it was his hands that caught her attention. The tattoos across his knuckles, intricate and dark, telling a story she didn't want to know. "Good evening, gentlemen," Sophie said, her voice carefully neutral, her posture perfectly professional. "May I start you with something to drink?" Vincent didn't look up from his phone. His associate, a younger man with cruel eyes and an expensive smile, grinned at her. "Dom Perignon, 2008, 3 glasses. And make it quick, sweetheart. We're celebrating." Sophie had nodded and retreated to the bar, where Maurice, the bartender, was already reaching for the champagne. He'd worked at the Azure Room for 15 years and had seen everything. He gave her a knowing look as he handed over the bottle. "The Caruso table?" he asked. "Yeah. Just keep your head down and your mouth shut. Those guys don't tip well, but they don't cause trouble if you're invisible." Sophie had taken the champagne back to the table and served it with practiced precision. That's when she noticed it. As Vincent reached for his glass, his sleeve rode up slightly, and she caught a glimpse of his wrist. A tattoo, intricate and detailed. A compass rose in black ink, with a date underneath, 14 de junio de 2000. Her hands had nearly dropped the champagne flute. It was impossible. It had to be impossible. But as she stared at that tattoo, her mind raced back to conversations she'd had with her mother 1,000 times growing up. Who is my father?" And Elena's response, always the same. "Someone I loved once, querida. Someone from another life." When Sophie was older, when she'd pressed harder, Elena had finally told her the truth. Or part of it anyway. She'd been at Columbia University, young and in love. They'd gotten matching tattoos, a compass rose, because they thought they were navigating their lives together, because they thought they'd never be lost as long as they had each other. Then she'd gotten pregnant. The man had panicked, given her money, told her to handle it. She'd taken the money and disappeared instead, terrified of what would happen if she stayed. Sophie had always assumed her father was dead, or in prison, or simply didn't care enough to find them. She'd never imagined she'd find him serving her champagne at a restaurant in Manhattan, wearing a $5,000 suit and the same tattoo her mother had worn for 25 years. The rest of the evening had passed in a blur. Sophie had served them mechanically, her mind spinning, her hands trembling slightly. She'd watched Vincent Caruso laugh with his associates, watched him conduct business with the casual confidence of a man who'd never been told no. And she'd thought about her mother, lying in their tiny apartment in Washington Heights, coughing herself awake at 3 a.m. because they couldn't afford the medication that might help. By the end of the shift, Sophie had made a decision. One that would change everything. The decision to approach Vincent Caruso's table a second time that evening had been born from desperation, not courage. Sophie knew this. She knew it was reckless, potentially dangerous, definitely against every rule of professional service. But as she'd watched her mother waste away over the past 5 years, as she'd worked 70-hour weeks and still couldn't afford basic medical care, desperation had become her constant companion. It was familiar now. It was almost comfortable. She'd waited until the meal was nearly finished, until the men were relaxed and slightly drunk on expensive wine and the intoxication of their own power. That's when she'd approached the table, her heart hammering so hard she was certain Vincent could hear it. "Excuse me, sir," she'd said, her voice barely above a whisper. Vincent had looked up from his phone, irritation flashing across his face like lightning. Those gray eyes had fixed on her with the intensity of a predator assessing prey. "Yes? I apologize for interrupting, but I noticed your tattoo." She'd gestured to his wrist, where the compass rose was visible beneath his rolled-up sleeve. "My mother has one exactly like it. Same design, same date. She got it when she was in college." The restaurant had seemed to freeze. The ambient noise, the soft clinking of glasses, the murmur of conversation, the gentle jazz playing through invisible speakers, had all faded into background static. Vincent had stared at her, and Sophie had watched his face cycle through a series of emotions she couldn't quite name. Shock, disbelief, something that might have been hope or might have been fear. "What's your mother's name?" His voice had been low, dangerous, controlled in a way that suggested immense effort. Elena Moretti. She said she got the tattoo with someone she loved at Columbia University, but he..." Sophie had paused, gathering her courage. "He disappeared. She was pregnant, and he gave her money and told her to handle it. She left New York instead. She never told him about me." The champagne flute had slipped from Vincent's hand then, shattering against the marble floor in a sound that seemed to echo through the entire restaurant. Every conversation had stopped, every head had turned, and Vincent Caruso, the man who controlled an empire through fear and calculated violence, had looked at Sophie like she'd just told him the world was ending. "That's impossible," he'd whispered. But his hands had been shaking. What happened next had been a blur of emotion and consequence. Vincent had stood up so quickly his chair had toppled backward. He'd gripped Sophie's arm, not roughly, but with a kind of desperate intensity, and demanded to know everything. Her name, her age, her mother's current condition. With each answer, something in his face had shifted, cracked, threatened to break entirely. His associate, Brandon, had tried to intervene, suggesting it was a con, that Vincent was being played. But Vincent had silenced him with a single look. "Get me her address," he'd said to Carol, the shift supervisor, who'd appeared at the edge of the VIP section, her face pale with shock. Now. Sophie had found herself in Vincent's Mercedes within 20 minutes, sitting in the back seat of a car that probably cost more than her mother's entire medical debt. The drive to Washington Heights had been silent except for the sound of Vincent's breathing, which seemed to grow more ragged with each passing block. "Tell me about her," he'd finally said as they pulled up to her building. "Tell me about Elena." Sophie had described her mother, the woman who'd worked 3 jobs while pregnant, who'd given birth alone in a public hospital, who'd spent 25 years sacrificing everything for a daughter she'd never planned to have. She'd talked about Elena's strength, her intelligence, her kindness, despite a life that had offered her nothing but struggle. "She was like that in college, too," Vincent had said quietly, staring out the window at the decrepit building where Sophie lived. "She was the smartest person I knew. She wanted to be a teacher. She used to tutor other students for free because she believed education should be accessible to everyone." He'd paused. "I was failing economics. She spent hours helping me understand concepts I was too lazy to learn on my own. She never made me feel stupid. She just believed I could do better." "What happened?" Sophie had asked. Vincent had been silent for a long time. "I got scared. My father had plans for me, expectations. When Elena got pregnant, I panicked. I chose my inheritance over the woman I loved. I chose security over love. And I've regretted it every single day for the past 25 years. He'd looked at Sophie then, really looked at her, and she'd seen something raw and broken in his expression. "You're my daughter," he'd said. It wasn't a question. "I don't know," Sophie had replied. "But my mother is dying, and I don't know how to save her." The apartment in Washington Heights was exactly what Vincent had expected, and nothing like what he'd imagined. Cramped. Dark. The walls bore the stains of decades of struggle, water damage in the corners, paint peeling like skin after a sunburn, the smell of old cooking oil and mildew hanging in the air. It was the kind of place that broke your heart just by existing. Elena had been in bed when they arrived, a thin figure under a threadbare blanket, her red hair faded to a dull copper, her face gaunt from illness and years of deprivation. When she'd seen Vincent standing in the doorway behind Sophie, the book she'd been reading had fallen from her hands. "No," she'd whispered. "No, that's not possible. You can't be here." The conversation that had followed had been painful in ways that transcended simple emotion. Accusations had flown like shrapnel. Elena had revealed that she'd lied about the miscarriage, that she'd been terrified Vincent would discover the truth, that she'd spent 25 years protecting Sophie from the knowledge of a father who'd rejected her before she even existed. Vincent had defended himself, explained that he'd searched for Elena after learning about the miscarriage, that he'd been devastated, that he'd spent years trying to find her before finally accepting that she was gone. "You should have told me the truth," Vincent had said, his voice raw with emotion. "If you'd told me, everything would have been different." "Would it?" Elena had challenged, her own voice rising despite her physical weakness. "You were terrified of losing your inheritance. You were a coward, Vincent. You gave me money to make me disappear, and then you disappeared yourself." "I was 20 years old and terrified," Vincent had shot back. "My father threatened to cut me off completely. I made a terrible decision, and I've paid for it every day since. But you made a decision too, Elena. You decided to keep my daughter from me. You decided I didn't deserve to know she existed." Sophie had stood between them, watching her parents, because that's what they were, despite everything, tear each other apart with words and accusations and the accumulated weight of 25 years of separation. She'd felt the anger rising in her chest, hot and suffocating. "Stop," she'd said, her voice cutting through their argument like a knife. "Both of you, stop." They'd both fallen silent, turning to look at her. "Mommy, you're sick. You need help, real help, the kind we can't afford." Sophie had turned to Vincent. "And you, I don't care if you're my biological father or not. She raised me. She was there for every moment of my life. You don't get to judge her choices." Vincent's shoulders had sagged. "You're right. I'm sorry. I'm not here to judge anyone. I'm here because—" He'd struggled to find the words. "Because I failed you both once. I won't do it again." "Why?" Sophie had demanded. "Why would you help us? Because you feel guilty? Because you suddenly discovered a conscience?" "Because no one should have to watch someone they love die because they can't afford health care," Vincent had said simply. "Because your mother deserves better than this. Because you deserve better than this. And because I can't change the past, but I can try to build a different future." Elena had closed her eyes, and Sophie had seen the war playing out behind her eyelids. Pride versus practicality, anger versus exhaustion, the desperate need for help warring against the fear of obligation. "What do you want?" Elena had finally asked, opening her eyes to look at Vincent. "I want to take you to a doctor, the best doctor in the city. I want to pay for whatever treatment you need. I want to make sure you recover." Vincent had paused. "And I want to know my daughter." The words had hung in the air between them like a grenade with the pin pulled. Sophie had felt something shift inside her then. Not forgiveness exactly. Not yet. But something like the possibility of forgiveness. The recognition that her parents were just people. Flawed, scared, broken in their own ways, who'd made terrible choices that had cascaded through her entire life. And now, somehow, those same people were trying to make it right. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button. It helps me bring more stories like this to you. The Mount Sinai Hospital was a different universe. Sophie had walked through those doors with her mother and Vincent, and it had felt like stepping through a portal into a world where money solved problems instead of creating them. The lobby was all marble and modern art. The waiting rooms looked like luxury hotel lounges. The staff moved with the kind of efficiency that came from never having to worry about resources. Dr. Reeves had been waiting for them, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and the kind of competence that inspired confidence. She'd examined Elena thoroughly, ordered comprehensive tests, and then delivered news that had made Sophie's knees nearly buckle. "It's not cancer," the doctor had said. Your mother has severe chronic bronchitis and early-stage pneumonia, complicated by malnutrition and extreme stress. It's serious, but it's treatable. With proper medication, rest, and nutrition, she should make a full recovery within 3 to 6 months. Sophie had felt the world tilt on its axis. 3 to 6 months. Not death. Not the slow fade she'd been preparing herself for. Recovery. Actual, real recovery. Elena had wept. Vincent had wept. Even Sophie had found tears streaming down her face, though she wasn't entirely sure what she was crying about. Relief. Anger. The overwhelming weight of all those years of struggle suddenly feeling like it might have meant something. But the real conversation had come later, in Vincent's penthouse in Tribeca. He'd invited Sophie over alone, wanting to talk, wanting to explain. The apartment was stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Manhattan, modern furniture that probably cost more than Sophie's entire education, art on the walls that she vaguely recognized from her one art history class. What had caught her attention, though, were the photographs. Dozens of them, spread across the dining table like evidence in a trial. Vincent as a young man, at his college graduation, in his first office, shaking hands with important-looking people. But in every photograph, his eyes were empty, successful but hollow. Then there were the older photographs. Vincent and Elena, young and radiant, so obviously in love that it hurt to look at them. At the beach, in a tiny apartment, at a diner, in every single one of those photographs, they were smiling like they'd discovered the secret to happiness. "I built an empire," Vincent had said quietly, standing beside her as she looked through the albums. "I made billions of dollars. I had everything I thought I wanted. But I was miserable, Sophie. I was completely, utterly miserable." "Why?" Sophie had asked. "Because I chose wrong," Vincent had replied. "I chose security over love. I chose my father's approval over the woman I loved. I chose a future that looked good on paper over a life that actually made me happy." He'd told her then about his search for Elena after learning about the miscarriage, about the months he'd spent trying to find her, about the years he'd eventually spent trying to forget her. He'd talked about his 2 failed marriages, his empty relationships, the way success had become a substitute for meaning. "I don't want you to make the same mistakes I made," Vincent had said. "I know you've had to grow up fast. I know you've sacrificed everything for your mother." "That's admirable, Sophie. It really is. But you're 25 years old. You should be in college. You should be pursuing your dreams. You should be living your life, not just surviving it." Sophie had wanted to argue, to tell him that some people didn't have the luxury of dreams, that survival was all she could manage. But something in his expression had stopped her. He wasn't judging her. He was warning her. He was trying to save her from the same trap that had caught him. "I want to help," Vincent had continued. "Not out of guilt, though I feel plenty of that, but because I can. Because I have resources that could change your life, and it would cost me nothing to use them. Let me help you, Sophie, please." She'd looked at the photographs again, the young Vincent and Elena, so full of hope and love and possibility. And then she'd looked at the successful Vincent, surrounded by wealth and power and emptiness. "What do you want from me?" she'd asked. "Nothing," Vincent had replied. "I want to give you something, a choice, the choice I never had, the choice to build a life based on what makes you happy, not just what keeps you alive." 6 months later, Sophie was standing in front of a classroom at NYU, and it felt like a dream she might wake up from at any moment. The scholarship had been reinstated, the tuition had been paid. Vincent had covered her living expenses, her books, everything. And for the first time in 5 years, Sophie wasn't working 70 hours a week just to survive. She was studying. She was learning. She was impossibly happy. Elena had recovered completely. The medication had worked, the rest had healed her, and the proper nutrition had brought color back to her cheeks and strength back to her body. She'd started working part-time at a community center in Washington Heights, teaching English to immigrants, doing the work she'd always wanted to do. Vincent had made sure she never had to worry about money again. But the real transformation had happened between Vincent and Sophie. They'd started having coffee once a week, then twice a week. They'd talked about books and philosophy and life. Vincent had told her stories about his childhood, about his father's expectations, about the moment he'd realized that success meant nothing without someone to share it with. Sophie had told him about her dreams, about wanting to be a teacher like her mother, about the weight of responsibility she'd carried for so long. "I want to do something," Sophie had said to him one afternoon, sitting in his penthouse with the city spread out below them like a promise. "With the foundation you're creating, I want to help people like my mother, people who are trapped between survival and dreams." Vincent had smiled. "Tell me what you're thinking." Sophie had outlined her vision, a foundation that would provide medical care to families who couldn't afford it, that would offer scholarships to students who'd had to choose between education and survival, that would create a safety net for people like her mother, like her. Vincent had listened intently, asking questions, offering suggestions, and then he'd done something that had shocked her. He'd given her control of it. "It's your foundation," he'd said, "your vision. I'll provide the resources, but you run it. You decide how it operates, who it helps, what it does. This is your chance to take everything you've learned from struggle and transform it into something that helps others." The foundation Elena Moretti had launched 6 months later in a community center in the Bronx. Elena had been there, healthy and radiant, watching her daughter speak about the importance of accessible healthcare and educational opportunity. Vincent had been there too, sitting in the back, tears streaming down his face as he watched the daughter he'd never known become a woman who was changing lives. Sophie had talked about the night she'd discovered her father through a tattoo, about the journey that had brought them all together. She'd talked about her mother's sacrifice, about Vincent's redemption, about the power of second chances. And she'd announced that the foundation would serve 500 families in its first year, with plans to expand exponentially. The response had been overwhelming. Families had lined up to share their stories, to ask for help, to express gratitude for a lifeline they'd never expected to find. Sophie had worked the crowd with her mother at her side, both of them energized by the hope that seemed to radiate from every interaction. But what had struck Sophie most was seeing Vincent in his new role. He wasn't the cold, calculating businessman anymore. He was a man who'd found purpose beyond profit, meaning beyond success. He was reviewing scholarship applications, writing personal notes to students telling them their dreams were possible, using his wealth not to accumulate more power, but to distribute opportunity. "This is what it should have been all along," Elena had said to Sophie that night, as they watched Vincent help an elderly woman fill out a medical assistance form. "This is what love looks like when it's not afraid." Sophie had squeezed her mother's hand. "We're a family," she'd said, "a broken, complicated, impossible family. But we're a family." Elena had smiled. "Yes, we are." 2 years later, Sophie was standing in her cap and gown, diploma in hand, surrounded by the people who'd made this moment possible. Elena, healthy and glowing. Vincent, proud and present. The boyfriend she'd met in her literature class, who'd fallen in love with her not because of her father's money, but because of her strength, her intelligence, her capacity for hope despite everything she'd endured. "Speech," her boyfriend had called out, and the small group had gathered around her. Sophie had taken a breath, looking at each of them in turn. 2 years ago, I thought my life was over," she'd begun. "I was working 70 hours a week as a waitress, watching my mother die slowly because we couldn't afford healthcare. I'd abandoned my dreams. I'd accepted that this was just how life was for people like us. And then a tatuagem changed everything." She'd held up her wrist where she'd gotten her own compass rose tattoo, matching the one her mother wore, the one her father had worn for 25 years. "This tattoo represents more than just a connection to my parents. It represents the moment I learned that life can change in an instant. That one small thing, a matching tattoo, a chance encounter, a willingness to be vulnerable, can alter the entire trajectory of your existence." Sophie had talked about her mother's strength, about how Elena had sacrificed everything to keep her alive, to give her opportunities. She'd talked about her father's redemption, about how wealth without purpose is empty, but wealth used to help others becomes transformative. And she'd talked about herself, about learning that accepting help isn't weakness, that dreams aren't luxuries, that family isn't always what you're born into, but what you build. "I'm going to be a teacher," Sophie had announced, "like my mother always wanted to be. And I'm going to run the Foundation Elena Moretti, which has now helped over 2,000 families access healthcare and education. I'm going to spend my life making sure that no one else has to choose between their health and their survival, between their dreams and their family. The foundation had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Vincent had stepped back from his business empire, reducing his hours to focus on the work that actually mattered. He'd brought in other wealthy individuals, convinced them that true success meant giving back, that legacy wasn't about how much money you accumulated, but about how many lives you changed. Elena had become the face of the foundation, traveling to schools and community centers, telling her story, inspiring others to believe that recovery was possible, that second chances existed, that love could survive even the most devastating circumstances. And Sophie had become the bridge between her parents' worlds, the daughter who understood both the struggle and the privilege, who could speak to the wealthy about their responsibility and to the poor about their worth. One evening, the three of them had dinner together at a small Italian restaurant in the village, the kind of place with checkered tablecloths and candles in wine bottles. It had become their weekly tradition. To family, Vincent had said, raising his glass. To second chances, Elena had added. To tattooagens, Sophie had completed, and they'd all laughed, a sound that contained all the pain and joy and redemption of their improbable journey together. Outside, the city had glittered with 1,000,000 lights, each one representing a life, a story, a possibility. And in that small restaurant, 3 people who should have never found each other had built something beautiful from the broken pieces of their past. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. I post new mafia stories 3 times a week. This is a story about the power of truth, even when that truth arrives 25 years too late. It's a story about a woman who loved so fiercely that she sacrificed her entire life for a daughter born from that love. It's a story about a man who built an empire and discovered it meant nothing without the people he'd lost along the way. And it's a story about a young woman who learned that accepting help isn't weakness, that dreams aren't luxuries, and that family is something you build, not something you're simply born into. The compass rose tattoo that brought them together became a symbol of something larger than any of them, a reminder that we're all navigating through life, trying to find our way, and sometimes the people we need most are closer than we ever imagined. Sometimes they're serving us champagne in a restaurant. Sometimes they're lying in a hospital bed, waiting for someone to finally care enough to help. Sometimes they're standing in a penthouse, looking out at the city they conquered, wondering what it all meant. Vincent Caruso never returned to his old life. The business empire was sold to younger, hungrier men who still believed that success meant something. He found his purpose in the foundation, in his daughter, in the woman he'd loved and lost and somehow impossibly found again. Elena Moretti discovered that strength doesn't mean doing everything alone. Sometimes it means knowing when to accept help, when to be vulnerable, when to let someone else carry part of the burden. And Sophie Carter Hunt, yes, she took her father's name, though it took her 3 years to feel comfortable doing so, became the living embodiment of what's possible when broken people choose to heal together. The foundation, Elena Moretti, now serves over 10,000 families annually. It's expanded to 12 cities. It's changed lives in ways that statistics can't capture. But more importantly, it's a testament to the power of redemption, to the possibility of transformation, to the belief that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be. What did you think of Vincent's choice to step away from his empire? Would you have done the same? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories from the modern age of organized crime, check out the video I'm recommending next. I'll see you there.